Welcome to Mac Talk. My name's Howard Fink, and what I'd like to do with these shows is explain how to use the Macintosh computer. Over the next several weeks, I'm going to explain some of the functions of Microsoft Word, which is the major word processor for the Macintosh at present. This show, I'm going to point out some of the features of Microsoft Word 5.1. In subsequent shows, I'll be talking about Word 6.01, the most recent release from Microsoft. When Word 6 was released, it was so slow that many people complained. A sufficient number of people complained that Microsoft, instead of abandoning Word 5.1, continues to sell it to this day. Many of you very likely have a copy of Word 5 or 5.1 on your computers now, and so I would like to explain a few things that you may not use on a regular basis that may make your work a little easier. In the future, I'd like to discuss Macintosh Multimedia, covering the major software packages, Photoshop, Director, Illustrator, and Premiere. On my screen on the desktop is an alias to Microsoft Word. An alias is a little program that lets you connect to the actual application. I double click on it like I would double click on any application icon. The mouse turns into a watch, which tells you time is passing. It's an indication to wait until the computer is done working. When the program is all loaded in, the mouse turns back into an arrow and you get a blinking vertical line that represents the insertion point where your text is going to be typed in. Here in the ribbon, which is a set of tools that duplicate some of the functions in the menus, but is right on the screen for you to use quickly, is the current settings for this document. This is the font menu. The current type is New York. The point size is 12. If you want other point sizes, you can either choose them from the menu or type them in. The number of columns is 1. It's a single column. Down below here, this is the style of the text in the document. It's normal. It's the only style that's currently defined. The justification, and these are 4 justification icons or buttons, is left justified. This is centered, right, and full. If there's not enough text to fill a line, full justification is the same as left. I'm going to leave it left for now. This represents single spacing. These 2 buttons, there's no space between paragraphs. If I were to pick the other one, there would be 1 line between paragraphs. Each of these lines represents a paragraph because it ends in a paragraph mark. That is, I hit the carriage return at the end of each line. These little characters represent a carriage return or hitting return on the keyboard, and it means start a new paragraph. The little gray dots are spaces. This is actually the function show and hide. Sorry. This button will let you show or hide these invisible characters. Another example of an invisible character is a tab, which is represented by a gray arrow. These are the tabs. The left justified tab is lit, which means that, or pushed in. If you look at the interface very closely, you'll see that there's a certain amount of highlighting, or the way they're drawn, they're supposed to look somewhat three-dimensional, and when they're pushed in, it's supposed to look inverted. What this means is that if you click in the ruler, you get this kind of tab. If I were to pick another tab, a centering tab, and click in the ruler, you get the centering tab, and so forth. To remove a tab from the ruler, you pull it into the text and it disappears. When you set a tab, notice what happens on the left. All of these little upside down T's represent tab locations, and when I set one in the ruler, everything comes before it disappears. The default tab locations are every half an inch. A default is something the computer assigns in the program if you don't make any choices, or before you make a choice. So the default typeface is New York, and the default point size is 12 points. This was chosen to be the equivalent of a typewriter document. There are 72 points to the inch. 12 points is the equivalent of 6 lines, 6 of these lines to the inch. So that makes 66 lines to the page, which is a traditional typewriter measurement. Now, when the mouse is in the text area, it looks like two parentheses stuck together. This is the text tool. It's shaped this way so that it fits between the letters to more easily let you select text. Or say I didn't want no spaces between 10:30 and a.m. I fit it in between and click once. That moves the insertion point to where I clicked, and I hit the space bar to add a space. You'll notice when I start typing, in this case hitting the space bar, the insertion point, the insertion cursor or the text tool, the appearance of the mouse itself disappears and will not reappear until I move the mouse again. When the mouse is in an area where it's supposed to do some pointing and clicking, like on the buttons, in the ruler, in the menus, it's an arrow pointing to the left. There's a special section of your document window here on the left edge. You'll notice between the 0 and the very edge of the document, there's some space, this space here, so that your text does not immediately appear in that area. When the mouse is there, it changes to a pointing to the right mouse as opposed to the pointing to the left mouse for clicking on things. This area of the screen, actually this area of this window, which you can increase if you indent your document slightly. I indented it 1/4 of an inch. It's called the selection bar. A lot of people find out about the selection bar by accident when they go to click to start a selection, say here, and drag. And odd things happen where they move it a little more to the left and click, and the entire line is selected. That's the function of the selection bar. One click selects the whole line. If you'll excuse me, I'm going to open up a document that has a paragraph typed in. Here's the selection bar, this area here where the mouse points to the right. One click selects a line. A double click selects an entire paragraph. Holding down the Command key on the keyboard and clicking selects the entire document. It's the equivalent of select all. Selecting is important because once something is selected, you can change its characteristics or move it around. In Word 5.1, was a new feature, drag and drop. I could select a piece of text, hold the mouse button down on it, and drag the mouse and move it somewhere else. I'm just going to do that over again. I select a word, pick it up with the mouse by clicking on it and move it. F1 on your keyboard is undo, so I just hit F1. This is actually easier to do than it is to describe, but I'm going to select the word state by double-clicking. When I double-clicked on the word plus its space was highlighted. That is, it got the color around it. When the mouse is in the text, it's the text tool. When the mouse is in the selection bar, it's pointing to the right, and when it's on something to click, it's pointing to the left. If I hold the mouse button down on some selected text, it starts to buzz a little when it's in the highlight. But when it's somewhere else on the screen, it gets this little pouch attached to it, which lets you know that it's carrying something. And when it moves around in the text itself, you get a blinking dotted line like the insertion point that shows you where what you're carrying with your mouse is going to appear when you release the button. So say if I move it here, and then release the button, the word state with its space that was selected is pasted in. This is called drag and drop. I'm just going to put it back where it was. And this is probably the fastest way to edit in Word once you practice a little bit so you're comfortable with it. Now in Word 5, if you double click on a word, you get the word plus its space. If you triple click, you get an entire paragraph. So you can pick it up and move it around. Say I'm moving it up a line. One of the features of Word 6 that's not in Word 5 is a certain degree of intelligence in editing. Here, if I move it against the period and state, if I move the word right next to the period, it just tucks itself right up next to a period, which is not correct grammar. Command Z is also undo. In Word 6, there's a certain degree of intelligence so that if there's a space, if there's a word next to a period or a comma, it will add spaces. Here I have one column selected for this paragraph. Sometimes when you're working with two columns, well, that's too narrow. Sometimes when you're working with narrower columns of text, let me just capitalize. I'm moving in the right indent. There it is. There. Here this is lined up on the left and is kind of ragged on the right. One way to, since by default when Word works, it moves whole words that don't fit on the one line down to the next, you can get a lot of space if the words are fairly big relative to size of the type. So there's a function for that called hyphenation. Hyphenation shows up in a dialog box with a title bar, which means you can pick up this dialog box and move it around on the screen to make it easier to see what you're doing. If I start hyphenation, let's put it down here. It checks the spacing on the line and then the following word to see if it can split the word. So I'm going to change this so I now have aircraft hyphenated. And here's torpedo runs. Here in the hyphenate field is the suggested choice for breaking the word, the separate syllables where the word can be broken, and this dotted line is represents how the word would fit up against the right indent. So I'm going to change this. So now this paragraph is a little less ragged than it was before. I'm going to close this document and go back to Untitled 1 and talk about letterhead. Some of you may have wanted to create letterhead to use in your ordinary correspondence. And I'm going to highlight this, center it, pick a typeface, bump up the type size. Really bump it up. Now, if I were to save this and call it letterhead, then the next time I were to open it up and save the work, it would be saved under this name, letterhead. The way to create this so that it's always new and you have some, when you open a new document like this, new, you'd like to, with letterhead, you would like to be able to open it so that the text that you've created is there tucked away on the document and you could start typing right at the beginning. You do this by saving the document as a stationary document. A stationary document is a special type of Word document that whenever it's opened up, it opens up as untitled with the text that you have just saved in it available to you. Now, if I were to close this and open it again, here in the dialog box, I'll double click on letterhead. See what happens. I now have the text here, but by default with stationary documents, the insertion point is up at the very beginning of the text. And what I would like is to have the insertion point down here below this stuff so that I'm just ready to type instead of having to move this insertion point down and get it left justified and all that business. The way to create a letterhead is to take this text and put it in a header. Here in the View menu, we find Header. When I select Header, I get a window with the same ribbon and ruler and a few extra buttons. So now if I paste into the header the text I'd cut out, I now have an empty document. I'm going to switch back to, well, here's New York. 12 point, left justified, single spaced, save it, as a stationary document to replace the old one. I haven't quite gotten rid of this formatting. There's actually a character here, this paragraph mark, and it's retaining this setting. save it as a letterhead, stationary document, replace. So now, if I were to close this, open letterhead, it opens up as an untitled document. However, if I look at it in print preview, the header is actually there. Let's just close this. I can also look at it in page layout view, and you can see the header. More importantly, the insertion point is where you would expect it to be. So when I go to save this, I could save this separate document and have this stuff on top of it, but the letterhead is still untouched. Now you notice a common mistake here is when I click the close box, I still am in the word processor. In order to get out of the word processor, you select quit. Thank you for tuning in. On next week's show, I'm going to talk about Word 6 for the Macintosh. And if you have any interest in suggesting a direction for future shows, you can send me electronic mail at finkh@aol.com.